It is my distinct pleasure to welcome back Professor Michael Munger of Duke University to the show, who is our first repeat guest. So, Professor, thank you so much for joining me again.
It is an honor to be a repeat guest.
You're the first and hopefully not last, but I'm very excited that you are the first. And tonight, we're going to be discussing your book, which you were kind enough to send me. It is called Is Capitalism Sustainable? And it is a series of essays you wrote about different facets of markets, market economies, the capitalist system, and the like. So I can't help but feel like the book was pretty timely. And I don't know whether you meant it like that or not. I have a feeling you kind of did. No, okay, maybe not. But something in the book really struck me at the beginning, which is a Washington Post article on the kind of feeling, I believe, among maybe millennials or kind of young adults about capitalism. And it was pretty negative. And funnily enough, as I was reading the book, a similar headline was in the New York Times in the style section. And it was the rich kids who want to dismantle capitalism. And lest I be, thought of as picking outliers, I did a little background and saw that in Gallup, as recently as 2019, about 50% of quote unquote young adults had a negative view of capitalism and a favorable view of socialism. So my question is quite simply, where are we with this? Why is this the feeling in the country?
It is interesting. I would be happy to claim credit for it being timely if I had in any way intended it. But in fact, these are just some things that I had written over time, and it came together at kind of exactly the right time. I gave a talk. I've given a number of talks at small liberal arts colleges, including some of those where there had been riots against right-wing speakers. And so people had me in, I think, in part to try to show that it was possible. So it was a little bit scary, but I always lead. So I did a debate with a Marxist professor about socialism versus capitalism. And I made a strong claim. I also make it in the book, and I made it in the context of the poll that you talked about. There's no alternative to capitalism. There are no examples. There is not one example of a nation successfully being able to provide at large scale for its citizens unless it's capitalism. The only examples of socialism are Cuba, North Korea, and a few failed states in Africa. Now, what usually happens is people say, well, wait, I'm talking about Sweden. But one of the chapters in the book looks at Sweden and documents the fact that Sweden in the early 90s recognized that if they were going to solve the problem of poverty, the only way to do it was capitalism, because you have to have enough money to pay for it. Now, you can solve inequality without capitalism. That's true. All you have to do is kill all the rich people. And that's basically what Cuba and North Korea did. Either kill them or run them off. So that'll solve the problem of inequality. I agree that socialism can solve the problem of inequality. What it cannot do is solve the problem of poverty. And so if you look at Sweden, it's one of the top 10 most capitalist countries in the world. It has one of the lowest rates of corporate income tax. It has zero minimum wage. The education system is entirely voucher. So they moved way to the right of the United States in terms of their focus on capitalism. Now, what they do have is a welfare state to provide for the poor. So they have a pension system, unemployment, and healthcare. Okay, fair enough, but they finance that through capitalism. So the idea that we're going to dismantle capitalism, every responsible country that has looked and said, we actually care about poor people. And I'm willing to credit the belief of people who say, we really care about the poor. Now, if you're just envious and you want to say, I want to make sure there's no rich people, okay, socialism is for you. But if that's not true, if you care about the poor, then you need to do what Sweden did and embrace capitalism. That's also true of Denmark. It's also true of Norway. It's also true of Finland. It's also true of Estonia. All of the northern tier of countries are exuberantly and robustly capitalist. And so when I said that in the debate, it got really quiet. And I have to admit, the guy I was debating, he was honest. He says, yes, and what we need to do is go back to Sweden in the 70s before they reverted to capitalism. I agree that it's capitalist now, but it shouldn't be. And the reason they switched to capitalism was that socialism was failing and they actually cared about the poor.
I want to offer one other counterexample that I think people might cite. I think the Sweden one is very familiar. That's the one you always hear, right? And it's quite funny. And I think you did mention this in the book at one point, that I believe the either president or prime minister of Denmark was at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government giving a talk. And he made clear, he said, please don't call us socialists, because we're not. It's a misunderstanding. We have a strong social safety net, but we are a capitalist country. But the counterexample I want to offer, and I actually think it's a great one because it'll help us get to a couple of other points that I really want to get deeper into, is China. China is one, they call themselves the People's Republic of China, right? The Chinese Communist Party. What do you say about China? How do you answer that one? Because I'm sure people say that too.
And so I have an entire lecture on that, unsurprisingly, for just the reason you say it, because it's what people usually bring up. If you look at GDP per capita and growth rates, China and India were the same all through the 60s. Then in the 70s, Deng Xiaoping introduced an explicit set of pro-market reforms, where in effect you have private property rights, but most important, they started using the price system. India continued to have a centrally planned economy. So it's an almost perfect natural experiment. You've got the two countries with central planning going along the same path. Deng Xiaoping introduces market reforms, and immediately China goes on a much faster upward trend and has been ever since. So China is actually the example that economists use, because it's the same country. It has a socialist system with central planning, and then it has a market system with decentralized prices directing resources. Once it switched, that's when China's growth started. Now, you can argue that China, and I think this is fair, you can argue that China is not fully capitalist because it doesn't use stock corporations to raise capital. And so the ownership structure in China is different. So China is a market system that you might argue is not capitalist. That's fine. I guess what I'm worried about is that many of the people who say they want to dismantle capitalism, what they want to do is solve the problem of scarcity by ordering resources around. That means they're going to get rid of a market. And so getting rid of the market system and the price mechanism, that's what there are no examples of doing successfully. And in fact, China shows that if you want, because the greatest miracle of the last part of the 20th and the earliest part of the 21st century is the fact that the poverty rate in the world has fallen by 80%. And much of that, but not all, is because there are now far fewer poor people in China. And the reason is markets.
In a system like China's, though, right, where you say that maybe it's capitalist, maybe it's not quite capitalist, but the free market parts are what gave them the success, which allowed them to uplift hundreds of millions of people from poverty. I think what sticks out to me, at least, and maybe some people who give you these objections, is even just a couple of weeks ago, Jack Ma, who is one of, if not the richest men in China, right? He's of Alibaba. He has this group called Ant Financial. I'll be honest, I don't know a ton about the group or what specifically they do. I actually think that's probably by design. I think Chinese corporations are quite opaque necessarily. But even he, right, who other than maybe the Premier Xi is kind of towards the top of the pecking order of central planning, gets basically shot down. His groups, I guess, again, it's an IPO, but if it's in such a system, it's kind of hard to call it that. But their IPO basically gets shut down because no one knows why. It just gets closed door meetings shut down. So what do you say about stuff like that?
I think China is on the verge of really bad problems because until now, China's been able to raise capital through internal taxation that often takes the form of really high exports without allowing imports. And so much of China's consumers are not really getting the benefits of Chinese growth. The government is skimming it off. One way to solve that problem would be to have private ownership, but the Chinese government is unwilling to do that. And so as a result, they're now capital constrained. They're not able to raise capital. I think China's on the verge of a revolution. There's a decent chance of actual armed revolution in China because the expectations of many young people are not being met. So the 30 years ago, you've got people living in villages, and the government says you are going to get electricity, a motorcycle, a washing machine, and a refrigerator. And they got those things, and they say, hell yeah, that's good. I'm happy. Their children go to college, they buy some real estate, they can buy a house in the city. This is great. Their children are now finding that there are no opportunities for them. And so as a result, the expectations of all these people that until now the Chinese market system has been able to deliver, the fact that they have not become a capitalist system means that the state plays favorites, which actually exacerbates the problems of inequality. Only the buddies of the state, it's a corrupt system. It's not a meritocracy. And China until now has gotten away by saying that it was a meritocracy. So I think that there are real pressures on China because of its inability. So the one road, sort of Silk Road that they were going to build in the developing nations, they've now pulled way back on because of a capital shortage. So China was going to build roads in order to produce ways that international trade for developing nations would be available. There was just a series of reports, an article in the New York Times, that's collapsing. So China is retrenching on many of its promises, not only to third world developing nations, but also to its own citizens that are the grandchildren of that first generation that Deng Xiaoping actually used markets to deliver the benefits to. So I think China's in for a real problem within the next 10 years.
And I think one of the salient points that you just got to there towards the end is that this is sort of not the idea that China's cronyism, the idea that playing favorites, the idea that the people at the top have been skimming and that eventually there's a problem at the bottom, that is actually not a bug. It's a feature of the system. I actually, before you and I were to talk again, before I read your book, I actually spent some time reading The Road to Serfdom. And it took me a while to get through because obviously there's a lot in there. But I know that you talk a lot about Hayek as well. Hayek's arguments are extremely powerful. And the idea that I took away from Hayek, one of the biggest ones, was that this is what happens in these systems. And it actually doesn't matter whether under totalitarianism they're communist, socialist, fascist, like Nazi Germany, or the like. It really doesn't matter. What it is actually the distorted systems of incentives and central planning that come into play. And so if we could almost even bring it full circle, right? I think one of the things that people object to so much in our country and in other countries that makes them say, I want socialism, is they're looking at the capitalism they know versus the socialism they don't, and not understanding that the capitalism they know, while it does have its problems, they don't see what the problems of socialism are. And the capitalism they know, they're objecting to exactly what you're talking about. So when you look at our own system, right, where do you see those kinds of problems? Where do you see the kind of cronyism? Where do you see the picking favorites? Because I think those are actually some of the biggest problems that plague our democracy. And the last thing I'll say really quickly is one of the things that fascinates me is that I think people actually have a very intuitive sense of this, even though they don't realize it. One of the things that was really kind of a rallying cry this summer was defund the police, right? You heard people who never talked about this before talk about police unions and incentive problems. And it's like, yes, exactly. There are incentive problems. But then those same people don't really see the incentive problems on the other side of maybe the market side or the healthcare side of that they want. On the other side, on the right wing, like you said, you have people who are very interested in maybe the NRA and Second Amendment rights, right? And they say small government for that. But then when it comes to other things, they don't see that it's the same government that's going to be administering those bad incentives.
Well, as you know, the title of the book is Capitalism Sustainable? And the short answer is no, it's not. That American and other market systems have a tendency towards cronyism. And some of it is for the reason that Hayek says. But I argue that there is actually an internal logic of capitalism in a democracy that makes it tend towards cronyism. And that logic is the pursuit of profits. Now, people who are advocates for markets say that people's self-interest drives them to look for ways to serve others. The only way I can make profit in a real estate transaction is if I can find something that you want to buy and a seller that wants to sell something that you want to sell. And so both parties have to be made better off. If I have a customer and I sell them a computer, I also want to be able to sell them another computer later on. So the only way that I can do that is to make a product that they're happy they bought. And then 4 or 5 years later, when it's obsolete, they buy another computer from me. So producing value is the way to pursue honest profits. The problem is, in a democracy, all too often, it becomes possible for me to divert my energies away from the pursuit of honest profits to the pursuit of profits through lobbying and getting artificial protections from the state. And so the way to think about that is, at some point, I stop hiring new engineers and salespeople because that's honest profits. And I start hiring lawyers and lobbyists. And I'm not even selling my product to customers anymore. I'm selling it to Congress. I'm selling it to Donald Trump, who imposes a tariff so that foreigners cannot bring products in and I can charge a much higher price. Now, it's still true that I earn accounting profits when that happens, but I'm no longer creating value. So, and this is, to be fair, this is a criticism that's been made by the left for a long time, but it's not an inherent contradiction in capitalism. It's a problem with the interaction between capitalism and democracy. And so the question is, how can we design a system where it is impossible for the state to deliver benefits to the powerful? And Jake, the question I always ask when my friends on the left say, well, we should have, the state should do this. Why do you think, leftist friend, that a system based on power would protect the weak? Why do you think that a system based on majorities would protect minorities? It's going to be even worse because every flaw in consumers is worse in voters. So Dan Ariely, the famous Duke professor who wrote Predictably Irrational, I've actually debated him a couple of times and I've gotten him to back off a bit because his claim is we need the government to do things. And the reason is that consumers don't have enough information to do what it is they would need to do in a functioning market. And so I say, okay, Dan, what happens when they go into the voting booth? Do they somehow become smarter? Do they somehow become better informed? In fact, the contrary is true. I know quite a bit about computers and cars because buying a computer or a car, I can go online and get a review. I can go and find out about movies or restaurants from Yelp. It's really hard for me to get accurate information about political candidates. And so I also know that it doesn't matter how I vote, it's not going to affect the outcome. So it's true that there are problems with consumers having enough information, but every flaw in consumers is much worse in voters. So we have this comparison where people, and you said it right, I think, people don't like the markets they know, and they prefer the socialist system they can imagine. But the socialist system they can imagine is not how socialism works. Friedrich Hayek has a famous essay, Why the Worst Get on Top. And the description, people from China, people from Central Europe, when they read that essay, say, this is incredible. This guy never actually lived under communism, but he completely understands the mindset and the approach of communist leaders. And so the difficulty, I think, with the why the worst get on top problem is that we need to have a competitive system. The only way that we can control the bad actions of the state is to have competition. But in every socialist system, there's just one party, the People's Democratic Socialist Party of something. And the reason for that is that the state doesn't like competition. Now, Ford doesn't like competition either. General Motors doesn't like competition either. But we have antitrust laws that give us some chance of having competition. There's nothing that says the Democrats and Republicans have to allow competition. So the problem is, and now I'm going to connect back to your question, in the United States, and actually in the world, there are new technologies that lend themselves to something like monopolization. Now, my first job as an economist was with the Federal Trade Commission, and I worked on antitrust policy for the US Federal Trade Commission in the first Reagan administration. So yes, I'm really old. But so working on antitrust, the concern that we had was high prices for consumers. Now, Elizabeth Warren has said that Facebook should be broken up. Google should be broken up. Amazon should be broken up. All of those things misunderstand the problem because they're basically free. I agree that Facebook is a problem. Facebook has a lot of power because we all want to have, especially old people, we all want to have the same network that we can go on and show each other cat pictures. You need to watch my videos of my cat, of my dog. Being able to share those on one network is really valuable. But it's free. The thing is that the users are actually the product. And Facebook is selling advertising and they're selling information about those users. I agree that's a problem. But the problem is not antitrust. Breaking it up is an old-fashioned way that doesn't address the real underlying problem of ownership of our own data. The data that we generate, we don't own. So we're going to have trouble with the unicorns of Silicon Valley that have become these giant, maybe monopoly is too strong because Facebook is not the only entertainment in the world. You know, I can look at Netflix, I can look at Twitter, I can look at other things, but it is still true that they have very significant market power. I just think that they're working with government as cronies, and they're increasingly going to need to be friendly with government. And the right is very unhappy with Facebook because they think that they favor the Democrats. Now we have a Democratic administration. It'll be interesting to see how cronyist Facebook acts there. So that was a long answer. The short answer is that I think many of the criticisms of the left about capitalism are actually correct. We are heading towards cronyism, and the United States does not have a free and open capitalist system, and that should be a cause for concern for those of us who want to defend markets.
So there's like you said, there's a lot I want to respond to in there. So I'm going to try to do it a little bit systematically. And it's funny that you bring up the social media companies because as I was reading your book, especially at the end, there's one of the essays is sort of in praise of Twitter, but this was obviously 7 years ago when you wrote it, 2013. So very different situation. But it's funny because that actually was the edge case that stuck out to me. As a guy, I think it won't be lost on anybody who listens to this or who knows me at all well. I am a defender of free markets as well. It's no secret, again, the first guest on my podcast, it's not an accident, was Professor Munger of Harvard, who taught me pretty much, gave me my foundations into libertarianism. And I do want to talk to you more about that too, because you're a guy who actually has run for government, governor of North Carolina as a libertarian. So I do want to get back to that. I do want to talk about the social media companies because that to me is a fascinating edge case and I think really puts a lot of our market arguments to the test. I want to say quickly though about predictably irrational. To me, it's funny, right? Because that title is almost a contradiction in terms. If you're predictably irrational, that implies that as maybe the first or second essay in your book talks about the nixtamalization, if I'm saying that right, and for people who haven't read that or don't know what that is, it's this process by which you make tamales. And the idea is that there are things going on you don't see that you don't just throw out because you might not understand why they're so important. And that's one of the fundamental arguments for markets. And we can talk more about that too. The other last thing I want to say is just, I think when you talk about the cronyism too, I think, again, I really want to hammer it home because I think people see it in ways that they maybe don't understand. So COVID has really brought it into stark relief because people have justifiably really taken issue with where government aid has gone. But I think there are even more egregious cases. You're talking to a guy who stridently argues against the 2008 bank bailouts, right? You're talking to a guy who stridently at the beginning of COVID argued against the airline bailouts. And so I'm sure you and I are going to agree on that. But nonetheless, you'll maybe be able to provide a better framework for what is so wrong about all that stuff than I will be able to.
In evaluating government bailouts, you need to keep the perspective of time. And honestly, once you've had kids, or actually once you've been a college professor, you realize that some of this perspective of time is the same universal problem. So I will often have a student say, I've got 2 papers and an exam tomorrow. Can I get an extension on this paper? Well, you're asking about it tomorrow. If you'd asked me a month ago, yes, we probably could have worked something out. But you've waited until the last minute here, and now there's a crisis. So people who favor bailouts generally say there's a crisis, we have to do something. People who oppose bailouts say, wait, it's the expectation of the bailout that caused the crisis in the first place. And so, yes, I understand that now we're in trouble. We probably do have to bail out the banks because otherwise they're going to go under and we're going to have a recession. But the reason that they took excessive risk was precisely that they knew that if they take excessive risk and win, they get to keep the money. If they take excessive risk and lose, you will bail them out. So you have to not bail them out. The only solution is to not bail them out. And then next time, they will not take excessive risk. The only way to signal your resolve is to accept these very high costs, because the banks are they're perfectly rational. It is rational for me to say, if I take excessive risk and you'll bail me out, my stockholders, in fact, want me to do that. And so in the book, I talk about the example of I'm the CEO of a large corporation. I can go and lobby the government for subsidies, but I think it's wrong, so I won't do it. And my stockholders say, what the heck? We're going to fire you and hire someone who will. And even if the stockholders favor honest profits, then some corporate takeover artist, somebody who specializes in mergers and acquisitions, can borrow money and say your capital is underinvested. You could make a lot more money if you would just behave like Solyndra and say that you're in green energy and that you can earn much higher return on your capital from subsidies. So I borrow money from a bank, I use it to buy up a controlling interest in your company, and then I fire all the managers, and we now start hiring lobbyists, and we get those subsidies, and the stock price goes up. So there is a problem in capitalism. I want to admit that there is a problem in capitalism. But the reason is there's a government failure. There's an incapacity of the state to make a credible commitment not to deliver subsidies. And if you look at the Dodd-Frank legislation, Dodd-Frank spends a couple of pages in the legislation trying to define a SIFI, a strategically important, a systemically important financial institution. And it says that no company should be a systemically important financial institution, because if one of those goes bankrupt, we'll have to bail them out. So we would like them to be smaller than that. Well, if I'm Goldman Sachs, I say my to-do list is short. Today, number one, become a systemically important financial institution. Because if I go bankrupt, the state will bail me out. So Dodd-Frank was a joke. It wasn't just the bailouts, it was the attempt at regulation that has now basically guaranteed that it's going to happen again. And so Barney Frank, the Dodd-Frank was Chris Dodd from the Senate and Barney Frank from the House. Barney Frank from the US House was the number one recipient of campaign contributions from Wall Street. Everybody saw him as this guy on the left. He was the number one recipient from large Wall Street corporations. It was an incredibly cronyist deal. So what happened was that Dodd-Frank imposes a lot of compliance requirements on firms. And you might say, if you're a firm, oh, that's really expensive, we're going to hire a bunch of accountants. Goldman Sachs has 100 accountants already. But if you, Jake, if you want to start a new financial firm, if you want to start a new investment bank, you have to hire 5 accountants before you have one account. Before you have any income, you have to hire 5 accountants just to do the compliance for Dodd-Frank. That means no new firms, no new entrants. All of the existing fat cats are protected by the very legislation that naive leftists thought was supposed to regulate the industry. It's a charade.
And so once again, there are always many things. I'll give you 2 things from that I get. One of them is that I think one of the things, particularly my friends who work at large financial houses, don't really understand is they tell me, oh, this new law, we hate this. My bank hates this. What I always tell them is, no, actually, they really like it because this crowds out competition.
Yeah.
Right. Like you just said, the fact that you need the accountants, the compliance department, the HR, the legal department, these are not things that make a level playing field. They're actually things that make it really, really hard to enter. That's one thing. And the second is that, as you say in the book, maybe the answer to everything is transactions costs. But if there was a second one I could offer, maybe it's Hayek. Maybe it's that Hayek has the answers. And so you mentioned why the worst rise to the top. Well, one of my favorite chapters was the succinctly named who, comma, whom, question mark. Who, whom. And the idea is who gets to decide for or to whom. And when you just bring up, right, that's a perfect example, special interest financial institution. Who gets to decide that and for whom? And it's funny because you'd think that with Donald Trump having been president for 4 years, one of the most disliked and aggressively disliked presidents ever, who, you know, when it was possible for him to do so, tried to wield legislation and whatever he could against people he personally didn't like, you'd have thought that have rung the alarm bells and gave people pause to say, wait, if he could do this, maybe this was going on before. And maybe someone else is going to come along who's a little more polished, a little smarter, and a little more effective at using these tools. But I think that's really not the takeaway people got.
That's a really good point. So it used to be I always had to have this hypothetical boogeyman where I would say, but what would happen if a really bad president had these powers? And now most people on the left will concede, okay, yes, it's no longer hypothetical. That's a really bad president. But their takeaway is exactly the wrong thing. Their takeaway is, and therefore we need to win back the presidency. Not we need to limit the powers of the presidency because we will not have a 1,000-year Reich and we will always control it because a Republican's going to win the presidency again. What we need to do is limit the imperial presidency. But the Democrats, their only conclusion was we need to win the presidency back.
And it seems to have hurt them because they lost ground in the House. And were I a betting man, which I was, I lost money betting on different elections in 2020. We won't go into which ones, but I was not successful, I'll say. Were I a betting man, I would bet actually that the Republicans retake the House in 2022. I may be wrong about that, but we'll see. But again, I think when you look at stuff like this, as a guy who is now, again, you've run for office, so why don't we talk about that? Had you gotten into power, what would you have wanted to do? What would you have wanted to do to realign incentives and to try to right this ship? Because again, I'm with you 100%. As a guy who wants to see relaxing of many different kinds of regulation, people hear that as just being financial. No, I'm talking about, I was very happy when Oregon decriminalized all drugs. I thought that was a great step in the right direction. I was very happy when there was a federal bill in the House to legalize marijuana, all these sorts of things. It's funny actually, because the drug case is another one where people hear decriminalization and then 6 months later, there's still a black market and they say, see, it doesn't work. If you criminalize growing more than one plant of marijuana in your house, how can there be possibly a market where the costs and the production costs and transactions costs can, whatever, we don't need to go down that road. It's pretty self-evident if you want to think about it for a second. But again, what would you have done?
Well, I just finished running for office in this most recent election. I ran for the North Carolina House, District 34, where I live. And it was interesting because having a campaign in this setting, you couldn't really go out and do much campaigning. So I had some signs, but I did work on some issues. And there was one issue that I was surprised how many people on the left pretty much have just straightforwardly come over to the side of markets. And that is affordable housing. So one of the reasons there's so little affordable housing is that many of our cities have effectively made affordable housing illegal. And San Francisco has rules that are so racist in their effect that it would have made a segregationist Dixiecrat in Alabama blush, saying, oh, no, that's too much. You can't do that. That's terrible. I mean, we can have segregation, but not like that. So if you look at, I give quite a few talks at conventions where people want bikes, walkable cities, or the urban planners. For some reason, I'm hot now on the urban planner segment of conventions. And a big part of the reason is my claim that we need to have fewer parking spaces And we need to have fewer rules restricting the size of apartments. So right now in San Francisco, if I want to build a new, let's say I want to build a small apartment building that has 6 apartments in it, I would have to get at least 15 parking spaces in a subterranean parking lot, because I couldn't have on-street parking for them. And that enough space for 15 parking spaces is really expensive. And they can't be smaller than 1,500 square feet. Now, 1,500 square feet is quite a large apartment. So what we've done is if you just want to break even, because it's going to take you 3 years to get through the permitting process. If you just want to break even, you cannot charge less than $700,000 for one of these condos. That's the cheapest, and that's if you are a charity and want to give them away. You're just going to do it for your cost. So that's no profits. Well, unsurprisingly, there's no affordable housing. But the amazing thing is that somehow the progressives in San Francisco have then said, and the reason there's no affordable housing is that landlords are greedy. That's remarkable. That's a remarkable switch. New York has many of the same problems. It is impossible to build new affordable housing. A lot of the reason is that people already live in New York, and I understand this is a problem. There's not enough parking. Well, they don't want to lose their parking. And so if you want to build a new apartment building, you have to provide parking either on the roof or in the sub-basement. That's incredibly expensive. So there's no way that you can do that. So a number of cities have recently taken to suspending the rules. Raleigh, North Carolina, where I live, you have to have 2.1 parking spaces per unit, and there are minimum size restrictions. So they're a multi-block area downtown. When I ran for office, my proposal was the General Assembly should pass laws suspending the requirements for parking and minimum size in urban areas, not the whole thing, but in parts of it. So basically it's an affordable housing growth zone. And I was surprised how many people on the left came out in favor of that. So some libertarian proposals, when you can explain why it is that markets are being prevented from helping poor people. A lot of times people on the left are really flexible. At another conference, the city manager of Durham came up to me afterwards and said, what I would really like to do is be able to give Uber vouchers to poor people. Because I have a lot of poor people. They need to go to the doctor. They need to go to the grocery store. They have to go and wait for a bus for half an hour in the cold. And then the bus doesn't go quite where they want to go. It's very difficult for them. They have diabetes. It's hard for them to walk. So we have these little buses that we send around, but you have to schedule them far in advance. They're inefficient. They're extremely expensive. If I could just use Uber vouchers, I could really help poor people. But politically, a bunch of people on the left just won't allow that. So I think that some of the hope for libertarian pro-market policies is to find people who care more about the poor than they do about ideology. If we can explain, look, we can help the poor. You say you want to help the poor, we can help them. There's a lot of people on the left that will cross over and say, since you honestly want to help the poor, I'm with you.
It's funny that you bring up Uber, because that was actually one of the first things that kind of set me down the path to really believing in the libertarian ideas, which was that in your class, my freshman year at Duke, we learned about basically Uber versus the taxi companies, and how the taxi companies, especially in my hometown of New York, with the medallions, they crowd them out. I mean, it's unbelievable. And my reaction was always, why do I care whether I pay a taxi driver or an Uber driver? It's the same guy. It's just the same person who's driving a different car. And the idea at a consumer level that there's any difference is insane. And so then it's clear that it's just lobbying interests. And one of the other ones that you bring up that I think is a perfect example is drug decriminalization, legalization, whatever you want to call it. There's huge problems and objections rightly to the war on drugs, mass incarceration. What's one of the easiest ways to get rid of that? It's not change sentencing, it's change what is or isn't a crime that is mostly victimless, if at all, victimized, and end that. So with feel free to respond to that. Or with that in mind, my question is this about the social media companies, to get back to that. When you look at that, what is it that's hurting us so much? You acknowledge Facebook's a problem. I agree. I'm not active on any social media right now and haven't been for about 2 years because I don't like it. I think it's really bad for a lot of reasons. Is it too much markets? Is it too little? Are those companies already cronyist?
Well, for the social media, I guess I'm of the mind that I think there's a really significant problem, but that things are not so bad that the government couldn't easily make them worse. So if you say our solution is that the state is going to be in charge of deciding what's true, that's a really terrible idea. So we have a problem. And as many people have recently complained, Section 230 of the Act will protect social media companies from being sued. They can publish or not publish something as they want. But suppose that I write something that's not true, and then Twitter declines to publish it in the sense that they either delete it or they put something under it saying this claim is disputed. Suppose we suspend Section 230 and I sue. Well, the First Amendment would say I cannot compel you to speak, and that includes publishers. I cannot compel you to publish something that you disagree with. These are private companies. So I think it's a problem, but generally my solution is more competition, not more government regulation. And I actually think that problem is solving itself. If you look, there's been a sequence of companies. You're much too young, but for some of us, we remember the time when IBM was a corporate behemoth and there was a lawsuit that was operating for 10 years to try to break up IBM. By the time that lawsuit was finally settled, IBM was no longer even an important player. But then the Justice Department went after Microsoft. And the problem was, and this is ridiculous in retrospect, that Microsoft was trying to promote its web browser. We don't even talk about web browsers anymore. The monopoly of web browsers is not a thing. So by the time that lawsuit was litigated, the underlying issue was gone. So right now we have our knickers in a knot about Facebook. By the time that's decided, then we'll be upset about something else. So I think the real bottom line is people should understand the extent to which they do not own their data and recognize, as you have, that maybe they want to consider an alternative way of communicating. That's fine. They should have full information about how much their data is being used by companies. However, I don't think things are nearly bad enough that the state cannot make them much, much worse.
I think what should make us most suspicious about that too is that you actually already have members of Congress calling for government involvement in the social media companies. I agree with you. Where I always come out on it is I look at it and I say what I just said to you. I say this is such a huge problem. There are free speech issues, although Google, Facebook, Twitter, those are not governments. They're not required to publish your speech. But you have, I think it was Ed Markey from Massachusetts saying that the problem is that the social companies don't censor enough.
Yeah.
At the beginning of COVID, Adam Schiff was saying that there should be more censorship of COVID misinformation, even though the government itself was changing.
Because he knows the truth.
Right. And again, it's kind of like the same government that gave you the Iraq war, the same government that gave you the NSA and mass surveillance, which has been a big one for me recently. I've been kind of on a kick with Snowden and Glenn Greenwald's work with that. But the same government that gave you all of that would be the same government you're tasking with regulating these companies.
The only entity that cannot regulate speech in the United States is the government. That's the only one. All the others can regulate speech, but the government cannot. And so it really does surprise me when members of Congress get so upset that they think, oh, but it's an emergency.
There's always an emergency. That's the point. There's always an emergency, and there's always a different one. And that's my argument with the airline bailout in 2008. It's a once in a lifetime event. It'll never happen again. I'm 24. I'm not that old. 12 years later, the airlines got bailed out, which did in certain ways very similar to things to what the banks had done.
And you can make an argument that it probably helps. This really is unusual, but there's always some unusual circumstance that companies recognize that if things go really bad, the government will bail us out. I think the interesting question is, are we going to run into a situation where we're no longer able to borrow? Because as it stands right now, the size of the deficit has increased remarkably. And the Federal Reserve has been increasing the money supply at a rate that's unprecedented. And the really interesting thing about what the Federal Reserve has done is, for the first time in history, and a lot of people don't know this, for the first time in history, the Federal Reserve has started purchasing corporate debt. So until now, the Federal Reserve would buy US government bonds. So you're a bank, you have US government bonds. I'm the Federal Reserve, I buy the bonds, which means that the bonds are now on my balance sheet, but you have money that was printed by the Treasury because there's just an account that I have with the Treasury Department. So that was how the Federal Reserve created money. For the past really 2 years, they've been increasing money by buying corporate debt. And so you've got these large corporations that are selling corporate bonds, not government bonds, but corporate bonds to the US government. So a very substantial part of the Federal Reserve is now corporate debt. And that, to me, looks like socialism of the worst kind and cronyism of the worst kind, because now the state has a material financial interest in propping up these large corporations. Because if the corporations go bankrupt, all these billions of dollars of debt are now worthless. And so what I'm worried about is that we're going to run into the limits of the ability of the federal government to borrow. And if that happens, we're really going to be in trouble, because the interest rate on our bonds is going to go up. We're going to have difficulty servicing the debt. Now, Donald Trump said he would just default. And the Democrats all said, no, we're not. There is real danger if interest rates go up that we will default.
The way you put it is just so interesting, because it's tautological in the way it works, right? It's really unbelievable that the corporations are selling debt to the government, which is buying them, which is therefore keeping the interest rates high, so they sell them.
I imagine the corporation saying, wait, really?
Yeah. I mean,
you want to give us money that you're printing for our debt? Okay.
It's incredible. And it does go back to, I asked Professor Munger this in the podcast we did back in July. And the question I asked him was this: when I ate dinner with him with some of my friends in college in spring of 2018, we asked him, what do you think the biggest problem facing our country is today? And we were kind of expecting him to say something like, climate change, terrorism, one of the usual suspects. And what he said was actually very surprising. It was the growth trajectory of the unfunded liability of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which, again, to me was an eye-opening moment. I had never heard anybody say anything like that. And it's echoing what you're saying right now. To me, it doesn't make any sense. I don't understand how anybody could believe in modern monetary theory that because you have the printer, there are memes about this on the internet, right? The stock market has gone completely haywire because people buy stocks. There was a Bloomberg article written about a Reddit page that basically propped up Tesla and later Palantir and things like this, because they all just tell each other, go buy them. It has to go up.
Tesla is worth more than Toyota, General Motors, and Ford combined. How can that be? And the answer is that the federal government is pumping money. Let's call it money. I started to say it fake money, but it's not fake money as long as other people accept it.
That's what's so confusing about it, though, right? Because this is the problem I think a lot of people have with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is so volatile, right? Yeah. That a lot of people understandably look at it and say, well, okay, that can never work as a medium of exchange. There's a famous story that I may have even heard in your class that early on someone paid 10 Bitcoins for a pizza.
Yeah.
So, and the guy, maybe he went and killed himself or something after that because he had just spent.
I would have.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be great. And what you hope is that the pizza company didn't really think much about it and they just kept them and found it on a flash drive.
There are stories of stuff like that too. But people understandably look at that and say, okay, this makes no sense, right? At least as it is right now. Nobody could reliably spend and buy this. People don't look at that though and say, this is sort of the road we're heading down. How can the US dollar sustain itself when it's purely on trust? To me, that makes no sense.
It always has been. And money, that's okay. That money is based on trust. We're trying to abuse that trust, though. And what worries me is that deficits are future taxes. And so what we're doing is kicking the funding of this large debt down the road to future generations. So what I don't understand why so many young people on the left are not upset about the deficit. This is the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth that the world has ever seen. Old people like me, instead of paying taxes, we have really low taxes. And we have enormous deficits that you people are going to have to pay for after we're dead. And we get to have beach houses and really great stuff. So thank you. I want young people, I want to thank you all for being suckers, because you are financing my lifestyle in a way that no one should have to. And why you would vote for people who want to expand the deficit, I have no idea. It makes no sense to me.
That's one of the central paradoxes, though, right? You say to yourself, people are voting for things like what you just said, that are the idea that anybody could not think that those checks would eventually come due at some point. It might not be tomorrow. It might not be in 10 years. By the way, if I'm lucky, I'll just do exactly what your generation did and pass it on to my grandchildren.
But that every bubble works like that. And you can say, I know this isn't worth anything. I know this Tesla stock isn't worth anything. I know this Bitcoin isn't worth anything, but I'm smart. And so I'm going to sell it before it collapses in value. That's how bubbles work. Everybody thinks they will not be the one holding on when it goes down.
That's exactly what I'm saying about voting. People always think, well, I'm not going to be the guy that.
Yeah, I'm the smart one.
Yeah, I'm the smart one who's not. And again, it comes back to the same thing with Hayek. It's a feature, not a bug, right? Everybody thinks, oh, I'm going to be the guy who votes for I'm going to actually do the research. I'm going to actually pick the right politicians. But it's always the same problem. And I think this is where some people say, well, we need centralized planning because I know that I'm stupid and everybody else is, and they're going to vote for this stuff. That doesn't work. Then the problem you run into is what happens if you start centrally planning it?
Adam Smith famously said that the argument for decentralization is that all of us have these sorts of impulses. If we have many different sources of power, they're more likely to check each other. If we centralize and we have an efficient system and there's just one chooser, a central planner, they're going to say, one of the things that always surprises me is people say, well, the problem with capitalism is a short time horizon. If I'm a member of the US House, how long is my time horizon? Well, on November 8th, it's 2 years. All the rest of the time, it's less than that because it's the time between now and the next election. So nobody has a shorter time horizon than a politician. If I have a corporation, then the stock goes way out into the future. It's the value of the future. Now, I admit Tesla's weird. I would not be owning Tesla stock, and I'm sorry I didn't buy Bitcoin in 2011. But if I had bought Bitcoin in 2011, I would have sold it in 2012 as soon as it went to $1.
Maybe I'm just cynical, but when you ask the question, what's my time horizon if I'm a representative, my answer is going to be my lifespan from the first time I get elected. That was going to be my answer. Maybe I'm just too cynical. But
it is your lifespan, and you have to win an election 23 months from now in order for it to be your career. You don't care about anything else except winning the next election. Now, it's true you want to win a whole sequence of them, but to do that, you have to win the next one. You must. You care nothing about anything except winning the election.
I think this brings us to a very interesting question, which is, I don't know if you've heard of this guy. His name is Vivek Ramaswamy. He's a Harvard grad. He's very young and successful. I believe he's 35 or 36. He's I think either a billionaire or close to it from his company, Roivant Sciences. And he's been quite outspoken on Twitter about what he calls stakeholder capitalism, right? And the poor incentives it creates. He talks about things like, for example, the NBA and its China problem. And the NBA is actually not wrong if they take a stakeholder view to view China as a stakeholder and to try to appease those interests. And he talks about it with the news media. He talks about it really with the stakeholder view kind of has corrupted everything. Is that something you think about? Is that something that comes into your understanding of what we're talking about?
Absolutely. And originally that claim I would attribute to Milton Friedman, who wrote the article about corporate responsibility. And he said the only thing that corporations should care about is profits, and people were shocked by that. Well, but think about it. If you have a company that says we will make donations to things that the CEO cares about, so we're going to take the profits of the company and then donate it to those charities that the corporate CEO cares about, would you pay more or less for that stock? Well, less, because you may not agree with the priorities of the corporate CEO. So that's going to hurt your stock price. Consider an alternative where the corporation just does its best to earn honest profits. Then I, as a stockholder, I can take the dividends and capital gains and I can direct it to the small local charities that I care about. And so you've got hundreds of people with better information about local needs that are directing towards charities that need these contributions. So Friedman didn't say there should be no charity. What he said was that the charity should be the responsibility of the owners of the corporation, the stockholders, not the managers of the corporations who like to be seen cutting ribbons at the homeless shelter or at Solyndra because we produced some solar panels. So the stakeholder capitalism is corrupt. Stakeholder capitalism corrupts the CEO because you get to go and claim credit for making contributions and getting your name up in lights instead of doing your actual job, which is to produce capital gains for the stockholders, the actual owners of the companies, because they are then going to take that money and give it to charities. So the Friedman idea was never we shouldn't give money away. It was that the owners of the company, not the managers of the company, should be in charge of deciding how to allocate our charitable contributions.
Let's bring it full circle. So with all the stuff we've discussed in mind, I don't think anybody could listen to this and say, these guys are not talking about market failures. They're not talking about problems of capitalism. I don't think anybody could say that fairly. So with all of that in mind, though, right, we also have talked about the problems of socialism and central planning and communism and all the countries that have tried those things. What would your, keeping in mind all the caveats and being a realist, what would your more ideal capitalism look like? What do we need to do? What does capitalism need to do to move into the future and answer your question, is it sustainable, in the affirmative?
The key to making capitalism sustainable is permissionless innovation. And permissionless innovation is that the article that I had about Twitter, I would still stand by. So Twitter, the little piece about permissionless innovation compares capitalism to a dance. And so different forms of dance, within the structure of the dance, you get to freelance within the particular forms of music. You might be able to sing or do jazz. So improvisation is an important part of being within a larger form. So I would say that the job of the state would, instead of having a highly structured performance, would be to allow for individual creativity within a structure of property rights. The great genius of the internet was that if I want to write an app and put it up for sale, I don't need anybody's permission. And if a bunch of people want to buy it, it can create value. So the advantage of apps and the sharing economy is that people are constantly thinking of ways to create value. And they don't need anyone's permission in order to put it up for sale. I don't need to ask for a majority vote saying, should we allow this? And in the book, I talk about the example of personal computers. For a very long time, even the experts, or the so-called experts, people who work for IBM and DEC and the big electronics companies, they thought personal computers were a joke. Why would we have personal computers? Nobody would want these. Well, it's true, most people didn't, but a few people did. And so the two Steves that were working in a garage in California managed to come up with some products that eventually turned into Apple. And then Bill Gates managed to come up with a software program that many people use. Now, maybe there's some problems with that, but at first, nobody would have bought those things. Those were new things in the world. So I think that permissionless innovation is the key. And that's completely different from industrial planning. What we're doing is we're trying to pick winners. And so Germany has invested billions and billions of dollars in solar panels that now are obsolete. There were first generation solar panels. They have a huge problem with disposing of them. They're toxic waste. They contain chemicals that are extremely dangerous. And the problem is that in Germany, the time that they need electricity is winter, and it's dark in Germany in the winter. So solar power probably makes sense in Arizona because you need air conditioning in the summer and you have sun in the summer. So that probably makes sense. Germany, the German officials have said, we made a mistake. Our emphasis on solar power was misplaced. So for me, and let me admit that I'm worried about climate change. I think the solution, though, is not saying let's subsidize green energy. It is tax carbon. If we put a tax on carbon, I don't know which renewable energy will work best. But market producers will compete to try to have wind power, solar power, other kinds of renewable energy. And the one that turns out to work best will be purchased by the most people. But it'll be a fair playing field because we'll put a tax on carbon, which is the cause of the change in the environment. So the mistake, and there was a bunch of stuff in this answer. Permissionless innovation, and if you think there's a problem, tax the problem rather than subsidize the answer, because we're terrible at judging what the answer is going to be. But if you tax the problem, then you will enlist the creativity of all the people that are trying to think of solutions. And I don't know which one's best. You don't know which one's best. The collective wisdom of entrepreneurs is people risking their own capital is the way that we should go with that. And some of them are going to earn really big profits and they will deserve them.
Well, here's to hoping. It was a pleasure once again.
It was a great pleasure, and I look forward to being the first person to be third on the show.
I look forward to that too.